Rodriguez Brandon began her life poor, Christian, and enslaved in late 18th century Bridgetown, Barbados. Yet within 30 years, Sarah reached the pinnacle of New York's wealthy Jewish elite. Whereas once her own kin had referred to her as mulatto, by 1820, New York's census and the New York Jewish community had reclassified her as white. This change wasn't a secret during Sarah's lifetime. Everywhere she lived, her partial African ancestry was known by numerous people. Her reclassification as white, despite this knowledge, tells us as much about the early history of how race was made in the Atlantic world as it does about the lives of early American Jews. I'm in the process of writing a book-length biography of Sarah and her brother Isaac, shown here. But today I'm going to just talk to you about a small part of that, her ivory miniature, which I'm going to use to explain her complex history. Sarah's miniature shows how genre and technique are inextricably linked to the biographical story that miniatures were designed to convey. My argument relies on new methods for studying these miniatures, as advances in digital photography have clarified how the miniatures were made and allow us to zoom in on the incredible skill required to place the very small specks of paint on the ivory surface. These details reveal how crucial racecraft was to Sarah's miniature. Racecraft is a term I borrow from Karen and Barbara Fields, and distinct from race and racism, racecraft doesn't refer to groups or to ideas about groups' traits. Instead, it refers to the mental terrain and to pervasive belief. Racecraft originates then not in nature, but in human action and imagination, or in this case, the artist's creative attempts to explain who Sarah was. As Barbara and Karen Fields emphasized, racecraft is not a euphemistic substitution for racism. It's a kind of fingerprint evidence that racism has been on the scene. Racecraft impacted the lives not only of Jews with known African ancestry, like Sarah and her brother, but all Jews. Sarah lived at a tipping point in discussion of Jews and race, when Jews were increasingly seen in racial rather than religious terms. In the Caribbean, as we just heard about, Jews often existed in a category between slave and free and between black and white, both in terms of their civil rights and their social position in society. In Jacques-Pierre Benoit's print, for example, a Surinamese Jewish shopkeeper is placed alongside other non-whites in the colony, and Benoit further underscores the Jews' non-white status by drawing visual parallels between the hand gestures of the shopkeeper, the tailor, and the monkeys. We see a parallel here. As colonial slave regimes crumbled, the categories of citizen and slave changed, as did how the body itself was invested by power relations. Back in Europe, racial scientists took up the idea that Jews were not quite white, and travel writers likewise attacked Jews, particularly Sephardic Jews, for being swarthy or black. Jews found themselves caught up in debates about where they belonged. Miniatures rebuked attempts to position Jews as something other than white by using the strategies of racecraft. Between the 1790s and 1830s, ivory miniatures played a crucial part in the construction of Jewish identity. By the 1840s, silhouettes and daguerreotypes replaced miniatures as the small portrait of choice, but for nearly 40 years, miniatures held sway. I'll argue that miniatures, such as Sarah's, help us understand why these were such a crucial genre for American Jews, as they're interwoven with the four main practices of racecraft. That is, ideas that govern what goes with whom, that is, sumptuary codes such as about dress, how different people must deal with each other, rituals of deference and dominance, where human kinship begins and ends, that is blood, and how people look at themselves and each other, the gaze. Miniatures help us understand how Jews, particularly racially ambiguous Jews like Sarah, aim to present themselves during an age when Jews' race was increasingly called into question. The portrait on ivory is the first and only glimpse we have of Sarah. Portraits mattered as they required the sitter's approval, and thus on some level presented the sitter as she or he wished to be understood. Sarah's life went through many stages. Shortly after she was born in Barbados, she was baptized in the Anglican Church, and she was at least the fourth generation of people enslaved in the Sephardic Lopez family. At the age of 3, her fate changed dramatically when her father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, keyed her owner to free Sarah and her brother Isaac. In 1811 to 12, the siblings traveled to nearby Suriname to convert officially to Judaism. And following their conversion, Sarah moved on to London, where she was educated at an elite Sephardic school. In 1815 to 16, she had her portrait painted as part of her preparation for marriage. Her miniature presents her as a fashionable yet modest British heiress, an appropriate bride for a wealthy Jew. She is captivating and precious. The materials and process used to make Sarah's portrait mark her as part of elite London culture and called to mind how far she had traveled since being born enslaved. Sarah's portrait is small. It's only about 2 3/4 by 2 1/4 inches, but it's very expensive. The ivory on which it was painted was cut from an elephant's tusk, and the sheets were so thin they were transparent. The ivory would have then been bleached to give it a pale, warm tint that mimicked the skin tones of elite Western Europeans. When combined with watercolor, the material gave the sitter's skin and clothes an almost magical glow. This translucent glow, however, came at an artistic cost, as the high surface tension of the ivory meant that the paint had to be applied by lightly scratching the surface with scrapers, hatching it with parallel brushstrokes, as you see over on this side, or stippling, which means applying and layering over tiny dots of color in order to change the gradation and to avoid muddying the paint. The materials and skill required to make miniatures meant good ones cost almost as much, if not more, than full-size oil portraits. And the process for making them was painstaking. Sarah's miniature would have required at least 3 sittings by her and 1 with her absent that relied on her access to leisure time, a strange commodity for women born enslaved. Although some artists signed miniatures or used a distinctive brush style, Sarah's portrait is anonymous. Yet despite this anonymity, you'll notice I refer to the artist as him. And to be sure, there were female miniaturists, including some Jewish women, such as the one shown here, but they tended to be unpaid amateurs. Thus, chances are strong that Sarah's artist was actually a man. In the first sitting, the artist would have placed Sarah in a room with both strong light and shade. And as the light fell directly on Sarah's face, the portrait maker would have outlined her face in pencil on drawing paper and then placed the paper below the translucent ivory so it could be copied with a delicate brush using those short patches or dots in a neutral color. Color would have then been placed on the ivory to create Sarah's pupils and light shading, again in neutral color, and been used to mark her chin and neck, keeping her body lines light and clear. Her lips would have been just lightly upturned in the corners, and I find her smile to be enigmatic like that of a Greek choroid. The end result of this first sitting was a light pearly flesh outlined typically in Indian ink and lake with light shading using vermilion and indigo. The pearly color of Sarah's skin in the miniature is no accident. Watercolor miniatures on ivory are a genre dedicated to whiteness and bespeak a moment in Atlantic world history when race and skin color had become increasingly aligned with elite status. The translucent whitish tone of the ivory was used to create flesh tones and served as the base color for the skin, as seen in the detail here from the portrait of Sarah's brother Isaac. The forehead, whites of the eyes, and shiny area under his eyes all make use of unpainted ivory to create a glowing skin. Sometimes a sheet of silver leaf would have been placed behind the skin areas in order to enhance that glowingness. The alignment of whiteness and elite status may also explain why miniatures were so popular among Atlantic world Jews precisely when their racial status had come into question with claims that Jews were too swarthy or too black. While early on some artists had tried using oil paints for ivory miniatures, they quickly found that the oil tended to slip off of the ivory and obstructed the translucent glow. Watercolors, in contrast, allowed the sitter skin to appear translucent and glowing. The ivory and watercolor technique was hard for miniaturists to achieve with sitters who had darker skin tones, and applying enough pigment to give the skin a darker tone meant that the sitter was commonly left with a scratchy or rough appearance. This visible roughness is evident even in high-quality portraits of interracial women from New York and Suriname. And although this scratchiness was left visible even to the naked eye, details of the brushstrokes highlight the problem. One strategy painters used for showing this darker skin on the ivory was to use that hatching process again. Short lines painted crossed or overlapped to create a gradation of color. And it was the same strategy that most miniaturists would have used to get the darker paint to adhere to the background of the miniatures. But while the strategy gave an appealing texture to fabrics, hair, and backdrops, it was rather disastrous for evoking the beauty of skin that didn't glow white. Painters who actively wanted to depict a smooth, dark skin were more likely to use oil on canvas or pastels on paper. By the 1840s to 1850s, British miniaturists working among elites in India would perfect techniques for depicting a glowing, darker skin using watercolor and ivory. But at the time that Sarah's portrait was made, most artists' attempts at creating darker skin tones on ivory ended up implying that the skin itself was somehow flawed. In ivories from New York and Suriname, such as these two, the skin color of the sitter becomes marked in the language the miniaturists used according to the manual of the day that was deemed masculine or hence undesirable for women. This was the work of Racecraft, in which, under the gaze of the painter, certain skin tones took on negative associations. As Karen and Barbara Fields note, everyone has a skin color, but not everyone's skin color counts as race. In contrast to contemporary miniatures of women for whom the artist wanted to foreground African ancestry, Sarah Rodriguez Brande's skin is depicted as pearly and smooth. If one were to judge only by the miniatures, both her skin and that of her brother was several shades lighter than that of her European father when he was painted in oil later in life. Either Sarah's skin was light enough not to require the techniques used by other artists, or the painter decided to forego color for the sake of letting the ivory's natural glow exude through the paint. Regardless, what I'd like to accentuate here is that the genre itself idealized whiteness, and Sarah's portrait takes advantage of this reification. This first sitting would have taken less than an hour to ensure that Sarah wouldn't become fatigued, as her relaxed muscles would have caused the portrait to look languid and dull. With that work completed, the artist moved on to the second step, which didn't require her presence at all. Before she would come back for sitting, the portrait painter would have worked on the sunset-like background with careful attention that the color harmonized with Sarah's dress and the color of the flesh of her face. As with the flesh, the fragile ivory gives the portrait's background that translucent romantic glow. The soft sunset of blues and pinks in the background sets off Sarah's luminous skin and the fabric's white folds. The painter probably posed a figure wearing Sarah's white dress by the same window where he had begun her portrait, so the clothing could be painted while sparing Sarah the tediousness of too many sittings. As the subject of a well-made miniature, her time was deemed valuable. The choice of clothing was likewise important. The use of ivory and the brushstrokes used to create her skin tones, like that, the clothing was imbued with sumptuary codes about what goes with whom. Sarah's white dress with its delicate lace drew attention not only to the wearer's elegance, style, and purity, but also to her literal freedom from labor. Although Sarah's portrait is undated, the neckline, high waist, and sleeves suggest it's from about 1815, when Sarah was 16 years old. If she looks like she leapt from the pages of a Jane Austen novel, that's because she wears a neoclassical Regency-style white vertical gown, probably made of muslin or silk, fabrics favored for their ability to mimic the marble of classical sculpture. After the high waist that we see here, the gown would have had a long, narrow skirt that combined with the light material would have draped gracefully over her lower body to invoke the clinging fabrics and draperies of antique statues. The neoclassical dress positioned Sarah as cultured and underscored her freedom. In France, the style was first associated with the Revolution and then with Emperor Napoleon and his wife Josephine, two figures linked at the time with most Jews and Jewish emancipation. The dress also gendered Sarah in response to racial messages about Jewish women and women of mixed African descent. Although when the Regency style first appeared, its exposure of the body's lines was considered indelicate and shocking. By the time Sarah's portrait was made, the style was considered chaste, neat, and simple, even though the shape of the breasts were often emphasized in such dresses, and in the evening versions, a fair amount of back and bosom might be exposed. Sarah's dress marks her portrait as similarly indebted to West Indian notions of whiteness and how they're encoded in clothing. Sarah's dresses were modest than that of the Empress and her North American Jewish counterparts, who wore dresses of similar make that were lower cut and had barer shoulders or shorter sleeves. Sarah's dress also contrasts with seductive depictions of Creole women from the time. Sumptuary laws in the colonies often forbid enslaved women from fully covering their chests in order to emphasize that their inability to govern their own bodies. In this context, the ability to cover the body signaled greater freedom, not less. Sarah's portrait defies West Indian racial stereotypes and demurely covers her body. Once the painting of her clothing was complete, Sarah would have returned for a second sitting in which all the colors would be applied to her face using those small stippling dots or extremely short lines. The artist followed the recommendation of guides of his day, avoiding gray or dark tints when depicting her face's shading, lest they give her face that undesirable masculine appearance. This fear of manliness haunts the portrait made of the young Surinamese woman we saw before. The gray paint used to hint at darker skin tones implied that somehow that woman's feminine virtues were wanting. Sarah's painter, in contrast, shades with lighter tones that emphasized Sarah's femininity, here aligned with whiteness. In the final sitting, every part of the miniature would be examined and perfected, starting with Sarah's hair. In the miniature, her curly brown hair is pulled back in a Grecian knot, and tendrils delicately frame her face. She lacks the stylish tignon found in Portrait of a Surinamese Girl by Mrs. Pierre Toussaint and numerous other portraits of free women of color. Free women of color were sometimes required to wear head wraps, but also co-opted them as a sign of cultural pride. Women of color in both Suriname and Barbados wore distinctive styles of head wraps, and some stylish Afro-Caribbean women in early New York continued this practice. Sarah's unadorned hair signals her single status in Jewish religion and highlights her racial ambiguity. Her hair is crucially tidy. By the early 19th century, racial scientists increasingly insisted that Jews' black curly hair, along with their brown skin color, revealed lingering Oriental origins, and caricatures from the era used out-of-control hair to undermine the idea that Jews could cover their bodies. Let's go forward a little bit. Hair completed, white would have been added to Sarah's eyes and the darkest portion of the eyelids, highlighting their impact. Eyes were crucial to the language of miniatures. Often, eyes in miniatures seem neotenic, too large for the face, and the largeness of Sarah's eyes makes her appear even younger than she actually was, innocent and vulnerable. The delicate intimacy of her gaze is crucial to the genre of miniatures and to Sarah's portrait. The portrait was now done and ready to find its companion, and in 1817, Sarah in her portrait did just that. Sarah met a young New York Jew, Joshua Moses, who was in London on business, a man with a portrait of his own. The match was a success, and on March 19th of the same year, they wed at London's Portuguese synagogue by St. Mark's. Within a year of their marriage and before her first child of 8 was born, Sarah had followed her new husband to New York, where she spent the final third of her life. When her mother Esther and brother Isaac joined her in New York, the Moses family smoothed their way into high society. Once denied voting rights in Barbados because of his African ancestry, her brother was welcomed as a full member of Sheriff Israel, with a seat adjacent to the congregation's president. Her children also benefited from her racial reassignment. Her sons would serve in the white militia, and her son Israel would become the first child of a former slave to graduate from Columbia Medical School, albeit unbeknownst to his teachers at the time. Another of her sons would become president of the congregation, and a third would marry the granddaughter of Reverend Gershom and Satius. Portraits like Sarah's played a crucial role in negotiating connections across oceans. They also helped present Jews as part of the Atlantic world elite to which they aspired, an elite which increasingly insisted on whiteness. Thank you.